was going to be. Okay, so we are recording. So I'll just watch for her and see if she joins. So we are going to just jump right in. We don't have to do a review. We'll cover the study questions next week on this. So we're just going to kind of get right to it. So Canto 1 begins as each of the previous Canto 1s has begun with an invocation. And so I know we've covered these invocations. They kind of level up each time we move higher. And so Canto 1, this very first tercet, begins and actually states very succinctly the whole thematic, kind of what they covered in Purgatorio, and also what continues to be a major theme, especially in these first couple of cantos, but all throughout Paradiso. And that is the way God's light is reflected through individuals. So it says, this is page 596, Canto 1 of Paradiso. The glory of him who moves all things rays forth through all the universe and is reflected from each thing in proportion to its worth. So while we might be tempted to kind of gloss over that and just kind of jump right into the rest of the canto, it bears a moment of consideration. The glory of him who moves all things, we know that's God. Well, it's capital H, right? But he's the primum mobile, he's the prime mover, he is the first cause. All of these terms are used to describe him because he, God, is the ultimate creator. He's the one that set everything into motion, and including us, including everything we see around us, everything. So it says, his glory rays forth through all the universe and is reflected from each thing in proportion to its worth. So this theme, like I said, continues on. We'll keep referring back to this. I have been in that heaven of his most light. And what I saw, those who descend from there lack both the knowledge and power to write. He says, I've been there, and coming back from there, I lack the power and knowledge to describe it. For as our intellect draws near its goal, it opens to such depths of understanding as memory cannot plumb within the soul. So as our intellect draws near to divinity, it opens to such depths of understanding as memory cannot plumb within the soul. So as we draw closer to God, as specifically, he's talking about his journey actually in the heavens as he progresses toward God, his memory, the understanding that he reaches there, he can't bring his human self to understand on earth, right? So he's just going on describing the limitations of humanity, the limitations of understanding the mysteries of God and the things that are divine. So he's granted this special understanding while he's in paradise, but once he's kind of returned to our world, he's struggling now to come up with the words to describe what he saw and the understandings he came to. So he will continue to, I guess, try to use very human terms, speak in terms and analogies and metaphorically in the ways that we as humans can still understand him. So, and we'll talk about this almost constantly. Nevertheless, whatever portion time still leaves me of the treasure of that kingdom shall now become the subject of my rhyme. So he says, whatever time I have left, I'm going to dedicate toward writing on this theme, and this theme is paradise and the journey toward and through paradise. So one thing to note about Paradiso, we noted this in Inferno. When we were in the Inferno, the language there that was used, Italian, Chardy does a good job bringing, English translation into this. The language there in Inferno is used is pretty low language. I mean, we even see some profanity and some just very low kind of language. Purgatorio, we're speaking a little bit higher, and now we've entered into Paradiso, the language gets more elevated. So we, as readers, it almost takes a little more time to get through it because you just have to absorb both topically the topics that they talk about, And then the language itself that is used is very much more high. It's more elevated. It's a little bit more difficult to understand, which I guess is all within the realm of natural, right? As we get closer to God, we're down here still on earth trying to understand these divine things. So Dante and Beatrice are kind of just dragging us along and helping us do the best that we can to understand what's going on. So his theme is paradise. This is what he's trying to tell us. He says, "O good Apollo, for this last task, I pray you make me such a vessel of your powers as you deem worthy to be crowned with bay." So if you remember at the beginning of the Inferno, he invokes the muses, just generally the muses. Oh, muses, help me to explain and describe what I'm about to try to endeavor to describe, this journey that I'm about to take, or I did take. So it's pretty low level, just general invocation. Well, when we move into the Purgatorio, he not only invokes the muses, but specifically Calliope, who is the daughter of Apollo. So, she was the muse. Of course, all the muses are daughter of Apollo, but she was specifically the muse of epic poetry. So he's, saying this is going to be an epic poem. Calliope, as the specific kind of muse, I need your help specifically. Now we've kind of leveled up again to this pro level invocation, and he's directly to the source, right? To Apollo. He says, "Oh, good Apollo, I'm going straight to you. I need your help." And this invocation is very long. It continues on. He says, "One peak of cleft Parnassus heretofore has served my need. Now must I summon both on entering the arena one time more." So again, these are very classical references. So Parnassus, which was the mountaintop that was home to the muses, Parnassus has twin peaks. It's cleft, so it has these twin peaks on it. And one of those peaks was where the muses lived, and the other peak was where Apollo lived, and the other peak is Syrah. So he says, that one cleft, or that one peak where your daughters, the muses, lived, that was sufficient before, but now I'm going to need both. I'm going to need all the help I can get to describe paradise and what it was like and the things I learned there. So he even says, upon entering the arena one more time. So he sees this as a challenge. I mean, this is a gladiatorial level challenge for him. He's entering the arena. It's going to be hard for him, and he needs all the help he can get. It says, "Enter my breast, I pray you, and there breathe as high a strain as conquered Marsyas that time you drew his body from his sheath." So this is a reference to Ovid's, it's a story in book 6 of his Metamorphoses. And this story was a guy, Marsyas, he challenged Apollo. And he said that he could basically sing a better song or write a better poem or something than Apollo. And Apollo took him up on it, and of course won the challenge. And this the result, you never challenge the gods and good things come of it. Okay, so Marsyas, in losing the challenge, was I want to say flayed alive. He was flayed, but he was actually like, his skin was just ripped off of him, okay, by Apollo. So there's a lot. This is actually a topic of a lot of classical art. If you ever go to the Museum of Fine Arts there in Houston, you see this. Actually, there are several pieces that have this as a topic: the flaying of Marsyas by Apollo. It's very interesting. It's not gory. They're very beautiful. But so this is what he's saying. Like the level of strain that you sung to beat Marsyas in that challenge, I need that. I need that level of talent at this point. O power divine, but lend to my high strain so much as will make clear even the shadow of that high kingdom stamped upon my brain. So if I can even get close to it, it'd be good. And you shall see me come to your dear grove to crown myself with those green leaves, which you and my high theme shall make me worthy of. So seldom are they gathered, holy sire, to crown an emperor's or a poet's triumph, O fault and shame of mortal man's desire, that the glad Delphic god must surely find increase of joy in the Penean frond, where any man thirsts for it in his mind. So the Penean frond, all he's talking about here is the crowning with laurel. Of course, this was something that was done when a great triumph was, successfully done, or we call these poets laureate, right? They were crowned with laurel because they had these great works. And so Dante is saying, if I can even come close to describing what I'm about to try to describe, then I will be worthy of crowning with laurel. The Penean frond refers to the tale of Daphne, so the story of Daphne, who was Peneus's daughter. And Daphne was a nymph, and she was pursued by Apollo. And instead of course, she didn't want to be pursued by Apollo, so he chased her down, and instead of she kind of called out to her father for assistance, and he turned her into a laurel tree instead of letting Apollo have her. So that's the Penean frond, the laurel. So, okay, great flames. Shh, I have company today. So great flames are kindled where the small sparks fly. So after me, perhaps a better voice shall raise such prayers that Sarah will reply. He says, if I'm not successful in doing this, hopefully my sparks that I'm going to kind of sputter out here to describe this, maybe someone will come behind me and be able to more beautifully, more adequately, more accurately describe what I'm about to try to describe. Okay, so the lamp, hey Ben, the lamp of the world rises to mortal view from various stations. At that point, which joins 4 circles with 3 crosses, it soars through to a happier course and happier conjunction, wherein it warms and seals the wax of the world closer to its own nature and high function. Benny. And so he's talking here about, and there's a picture of this in the notes on page 603. This is very, the point of it is, okay, it's kind of complicated, but he's talking about the sun being high, approximately high noon, or maybe even exactly high noon on the vernal equinox, the spring equinox. So he says, this is the time when the sun, S-U-N, is at its most powerful. And the vernal equinox, of course, being the spring equinox, indicating that, okay, it's springtime now. So, and this is really where we see on Earth, in our hemisphere, the greatest amount of growth, the greatest amount of power. The sun is warming the Earth, is making things grow, is creating a lot of change on Earth, so affecting a lot of change on Earth. So it's the most powerful. That glad conjunction had made it evening here and morning there. The south was all alight, while darkness rode the northern hemisphere. When I saw Beatrice had turned left to raise her eyes up to the sun, no eagle ever staring at its shining with so fixed a gaze. So she is looking up at the sun, and so he is going to instinctually follow her gaze. As a ray descending from the sky gives rise to another which climbs back again, as a pilgrim yearns for home, so through my eye her action, like a ray into my mind, gave rise to mine. So he sees her look, so he looks as well. I stared into the sun so hard that here it would have left me blind. Of course, you don't ever stare into the sun, but he was able to do it. But much is granted to our senses there, in that garden made to be man's proper place, that is not granted us when we are here. So again, remember where he is. He is geographically still in the terrestrial paradise, right? In the earthly paradise. So she's there with him. She's his guide now. She's looking up at the sun. He's looking up at the sun as well. And he's saying there in the earthly paradise where man was designed to be, we have certain capabilities and powers that we don't have on Earth. So he was able to look at the sun. Don't try looking at the sun. So he says, I had to look away soon, and yet not so soon, but what I saw him spark and blaze like new tapped iron when it pours white hot. And suddenly, as it appeared to me, day was added to day. as if he who can had added a new sun to heaven's glory. So he was looking at the sun, and he looked at it as long as he could bear until he had to turn away. And then he noticed that everything got brighter, right? It was like day was added to day. So it was almost doubled, like doubled in brightness. If God wanted to, of course, he could throw another sun in the sky. This is kind of what Dante's saying. There's this incredible increased brightness. Beatrice stared at the eternal spheres, entranced, unmoving, and I looked away from the sun's height to fix my eyes on hers. So this isn't really the first time he looked at her eyes. He's looked at her eyes before, but this is the first time in Paradiso that he finds himself looking at her eyes or looking at her and then becoming quickly kind of lost in it. And we see this every progression outward. Hey, Ben, go play with your toys over there in the den, okay?
Sure.
Okay. So he does this consistently. This is his way of transitioning from sphere to sphere. This is how he describes it. And it's not just her brightness, but also her beauty, because remember, if we're seeking truth, goodness, and beauty, then we need a guide who's going to lead us to those things. And of course, we already know goodness. We're kind of already there. We've shed our sins, and we don't even have any concupiscence anymore, drawing back towards sin. So now he's still seeking truth, capital T, which of course the ultimate truth is going to be in God. So that's where he's headed. Beauty is right there in front of him. Beauty is Beatrice, right? So, and that's kind of the whole point of her being there. She's to guide him. And when he looks at her, he almost loses his mind. His brain just kind of turns to mush, and he even loses his train of thought. He forgets questions that he's about to ask. It's always a very startling effect that her beauty has on him. So this is the first time. So he looks at her eyes, and it says, and as I looked, I felt begin within me what Glaucus felt eating the herb that made him a god among the others in the sea. So this is also an Ovidian reference. So Glaucus was a fisherman, and he caught this whole net of fish, and it was kind of entangled with these herbs, like sea herbs or whatever. And he's on the beach, and he sees the fish, which should be dying, right? Because they're drowning in oxygen or drowning in air. And instead of dying, these fish are actually kind of trying to dance their way back to the sea. And so he notices this phenomena, and he looks at the herbs, and I guess in his mind, he thinks, these are some crazy herbs. I would like to eat one of these. And so he does. He eats it. It's a story, but so he eats it. And it turns out that the herbs actually have power to change him. And of course, Ovid's whole work is called the Metamorphoses. It's all about change. Everything and every single aspect of it, it talks about change, something changing into something else. And here we have Glaucus turning into, and so he eats this herb, and he feels that he falls in love with the sea, and he feels this insurmountable desire to return to this, like to go to the sea, to return to the sea. So he does. He eats the herb, and he goes to the sea, and he actually becomes a merman, right? A mermaid. So he's called the Euboean mermaid, but he's a god of the sea, and he comes up later in stories. But so the whole point here, this analogy, this comparison, is to let us know the extent of the feeling of change that was occurring within Dante. So he says, okay, so I felt begin within me what Glaucus felt when he ate that desire to return, that overwhelming shift that's happening. And he then begins to, at the top of 599, talk more about this. He says, how speak transhuman change to human sense? How can I describe transhumanization to someone who's never experienced it? He says, I can't. He says, let the example speak until God's grace grants the pure spirit the experience. He says, I can't describe it to you. I'm sorry. You're just going to have to read about, the Euboean mermaid and be satisfied that is how I felt. Whatever your imagination kind of coaxes up inside you, that's how it felt. So until God brings you to heaven, and then you feel it yourself. Whether I rose in only the last creative part of my being, O love, that rulest heaven thou knowest, by whose lamp I was translated. So he begins to rise. When the great wheel that spins eternally in longing for thee captured my attention by that harmony attuned and heard by thee, I saw a blaze with sun from side to side, a reach of heaven. Not all the rains and rivers of all of time could make a sea so wide. That radiance and that new heard melody fired me with such a yearning for their cause as I had never felt before. So he begins to have, and of course, the whole comedy is very sensual. We're constantly being bombarded by, feelings of touch, smells, sounds, everywhere from the Inferno to, through Purgatorio and the Inferno, we're smelling horrible smells and hearing shrieks and wails and, feeling burning pitch and experiencing, itching and all of these horrible kind of torments. And then even in Purgatorio, we walk through these trials, these penances with the spirits that are there. We feel the crushing weight of our pride. We feel, the denial of sight and the itch of the hair shirts of those, suffering on the terrace of envy or the cornice of envy. We feel these things, we see these things, we taste them, we smell them, the stinging smoke, of wrath. These are all very sensory things. So here he's bringing it back to that. He says, not only is it bright and beautiful, but I feel this desire to return. I feel this overwhelming draw towards something higher. And then he says, okay, so I saw a blaze with sun from side to side, a reach of heaven. Not all the rains and rivers of all time could make a sea so wide. That radiance and that new heard melody fired me with such a yearning for the causes I have never felt before. So not only does he see all this stuff and kind of feel it, but he hears the music of the spheres, what we call the music of the spheres. And so this is like heavenly chorus, and it's, I know you guys are musicians, so you understand what it feels like to be utterly transported by a piece of music, whether you're playing it and hearing it or hearing somebody else perform it. I think it happens on both ends. You can absolutely feel and experience it on a what seems like a divine level. And this is what he's talking about. He hears this melody, the music of the spheres, and it's just one more thing to add to that that draw toward God. It's beautiful. It's just a really beautiful kind of image. And she, Beatrice, who saw my every thought as well as I, saw my perplexity. Before I asked my question, she had started her reply. Remember, we talked about the fact that Beatrice can read his mind. Everything that's going through his mind, thank goodness it's all clean now, right? She can see, and he doesn't even have to ask the questions that he has. He even has just growing, he talks about this, growing questions, and she jumps on it and answers it for him. Thus she began, you dull your own perceptions with false imaginings and do not grasp what would be clear but for your preconceptions. She said, whatever you're thinking, throw it out of your mind, because you have some preconceived notions going on in there that's actually blinding you to what is actually happening. You think you're still on Earth. Where are we then, right? The lightning spear never fled downward from its natural place as rapidly as you are rising there. So she says lightning flashes slower than the rate at which you are rising at this point. So he's a little bit slow on the uptake. That's okay. We're right there with him, right? I grasped her brief and smiling words and shed my first perplexity, but found myself entangled in another. And I said, and what did I tell you guys about questions? He has so many questions the whole time we're here, and just question. So he had one question answered that he didn't even have to answer or ask. Now here comes another one. My mind, already recovered from the surprise of the great marvel you have just explained, is now amazed anew. How can I rise in my gross body through such airy substance? And Beatrice, she sighed in pity and turned as might a mother to a delirious child. The elements of all things, she began, whatever their mode, observe an inner order. It is this form that makes the universe resemble God. So she's trying to describe to him why, because he's asking, well, how can I rise? I'm heavy. right? I have density, and my gross body is here. How can I rise through this airy substance? So remember, they're rising from sphere to sphere, so they're kind of going through these the hemispheres, right, and headed toward the sphere of the moon, or the heaven of the moon. Not there yet, but rising up through. And so she says, okay, so things all have this natural order imbued by God. God is, as the first mover, the primal cause. Law, capital L, was created by him. So this inner order, and remember, we're all created imago Dei, in the image of God. So we resemble, in our most pure form, which Dante is the closest that he's going to be, to that right now. We most resemble God. So like attracts like. And so this is what she's trying to say. In this, the higher creatures see the hand of the eternal worth, which is the goal to which these norms conduce, being so planned. We are going to be drawn back toward God. All being within this order, by the laws of its own nature, is impelled to find its proper station round its primal cause. So wherever you are destined to be, or wherever God's wills you to be, that is where you will be drawn. Thus, every nature moves across the tide of the great sea of being to its own port, each with its given instinct as its guide. This instinct draws the fire about the moon. It is the mover in the mortal heart. It draws the earth together and makes it one. Not only the brute creatures, not humans, but brute creatures not without free will, but all those possessed of intellect and love, that's humans. This instinct drives to their mark as a bow shoots forth its arrows. The providence that makes all things hunger here satisfies forever with its light the heaven within which whirls the fastest sphere. So the heavens, as we are progressing outward, not only do they get more beautiful and more bright, but we start at the slowest sphere and progress outward in speed as well. So the fastest sphere is going to be the Empyrean. That's going to be, the prima mobile, or where God is. So that's what she's talking about, the fastest sphere. And to it now, as to a place foretold, are we too soaring, driven by that bow whose every arrow finds a mark of gold. It is true that oftentimes the form of a thing does not respond to the intent of the art, the matter being deaf to summoning. Just so, the creature sometimes travels wide of this true course, for even when so driven, it still retains the power to turn aside, exactly as we may see the heaven's fire plunge from a cloud. And its first impulse may be twisted earthward by a false desire. So she says, we are naturally drawn toward God, but just like, we had this whole discussion about love, sometimes we veer a little off course as we're headed toward God, right? Sometimes she says we kind of go wide of the course, we take these little detours. Our free will allows us to make those decisions. It allows us to choose sin. It allows us, and what God really wills for us is to choose God, right? That's the ultimate love, is to choose God over sin, over temptation. So this is what she's saying. You should not, as I see it, marvel more at your ascent than at a river's fall from a high mountain to a valley floor. She says, just as water seeks its lowest point, with gravity, your soul, being good and pure and true and in line with God's will, is going to seek God. So she says, you shouldn't be shocked by this when you know the law behind it. If you, free as you are of every dross, had settled and had come to rest below, that would indeed have been as marvelous. So she said, if you had done the opposite and fallen back toward earth, that would have been weird. Okay. As a still flame there in the mortal plane. Okay. Flames are never still, right? Any candle in any situation is going to be kind of dancing around. So saying, she turned her eyes to heaven again. And that brings us to the end of Canto 1. So she is always looking toward heaven. And we are always looking toward her, because as humans, and Dante, this is perfectly described, Dante the human, Dante cannot bear to look at God directly, of course. So where do we look as humans? If we can't understand God, we look to other humans who are holy to guide the way. We look toward the example set by humans, holy humans, to guide us toward God. They are the way the little glasses we have to use to view God. Because we can't always look at him. We can't look at him directly. We can't bear that truth. We can't understand God. So we have to look through human ways. Okay, so that brings us to Canto 2. So then we begin this sort of prolonged metaphor about the boat. And this is where Dante, he warns us. He says, I mean, in all actuality, he says, look, if you're not ready for some seriously deep subject matter, you might as well just stop reading now, because anybody who progresses on past this has got to be serious about it, right? And of course, in the context of a class, I have to kind of make you progress on beyond this. But this really is, it begins a very serious discussion. And like I said, the language is elevated. It's a little harder to kind of wade through. The topics can be quite difficult to kind of comprehend, some of which I'm going to just kind of gloss over because I don't really feel like some of, like she even talks about like science experiments, essentially. You know, we'll talk about the basics. We'll talk about, you know, the point. We'll get to the point, but we won't get all mired in the details. Okay. Okay. So 606. Oh, you who in your wish to hear these things have followed thus far in your little skiffs the wake of my great ship that sails and sings, turn back and make your way to your own coast. He says, if you are following in my wake in a little boat, you better just go on home, because you're not going to be able to keep up. Do not commit yourself to the main deep. For losing me, all may perhaps be lost. My course is set for an uncharted sea. Minerva fills my sail, Apollo steers, and 9 new muses point the pole for me. So he says, instead of following these old muses, the 9 new muses are the planets. That's where he's headed. You other few who have set yourselves to eat the bread of angels, that's out of Psalms, by which we live on earth, but of which no man ever grew replete, you may well trust your keel to the salt track and follow in the furrow of my wake, ahead of the parted waters that close back. So if you're serious, stay close. Those heroes who sailed to Colchis, there to see their glorious Jason turned into a plowman, were not as filled with wonder as you will be. So Jason, the story of Jason and the Argonauts, you know, Jason had a goal, and that was to find, you know, good plowland, good farmland. So he went off adventuring and had all these great adventures and became this great hero. But when he found his land and arrived there, he was happy to cast aside the adventuring and plow his furrows. And his men, who were adventurers by trade, were shocked at this. But that's the point, right? He had accomplished his goal and they were shocked to see it. So he says, those heroes who sailed with him were not as filled with wonder as you will be, of the things you will see. The connate and perpetual thirst we feel for the godlike realm bore us almost as swiftly as the sight soars to see the heavens wheel. Beatrice was looking upward, and I at her, when in the time it takes a bolt to strike, lightning, or no, bolt being arrow, fly, and be resting in the bowstring's blur, I found myself in a place where a wondrous thing drew my entire attention, whereat she from whom I could not hide my mind's least yearning turned and said, as much in joy as beauty, to God, who has raised us now to the first star, direct your thoughts in glad and grateful duty. So again, he's looking at her, and her job is to constantly just, you know, just like the saints always, they saw it. Her job is to direct him to God, constantly direct him to God. I'm bringing you to God. I'm bringing you to God. So here, even though he was looking at her and they, you know, were brought up, he's looking at her, but she says, now back to God. Direct your eyes, your mind, your gratitude, your thoughts to God. It seemed to me a cloud as luminous and dense and smoothly polished as a diamond struck by a ray of sun enveloped us. We were received into the elements of the eternal pearl, as water takes light to itself with no change to its substance. So this begins an interesting conversation. They are received into the sphere of the moon. Okay. And as we're thinking about it, we're thinking about, you know, planets as these dense little balls, or, I always like to think of, those, I don't know if you guys have ever made one of those mobiles with the styrofoam balls to represent the solar system or whatever. That's kind of how we think about planets. Of course, some of the planets are gaseous, right? But in this case, these are spheres. They're concentric circles. So he's rising up into them, and they do have substance, but his substance, because remember, he's rising in his gross body, his physical body, his substance doesn't affect their substance at all. So, I guess the way I like to think about it is, if you have a glass of water and you put, a ball like a marble or something in it, and it displaces that water, and you'll see the water rise because there's only so much space in there. Well, that doesn't happen. The substance of the sphere of the moon is not displaced by the fact that Dante's there in his gross body. Also, if you drop some food coloring or something into water, it'll change the color of the water, even slightly if it's only one drop. Dante, his substance doesn't affect the sphere of the moon at all. He's there fully himself in his gross body, and the sphere is there fully itself in its substance, and they don't impact each other. So then he keeps talking about this. It's fascinating to him. It says that if I was a body, nor need we in this case conceive how one dimension can bear another, which must be if two bodies fill one space, the more should my desire burn like the sun to see that essence in which one may see how human nature and God blend into one. And he says, so me going through this experience made me more fully be able to comprehend the divine mystery of Jesus being God and man, right? So fully God, fully man. He kind of delves off it for just a second. He says, we're not even going to talk about the phenomenon of basically two realms existing in one place, two dimensions coexisting in one place. We're not even going to talk about that, thank goodness, because we got enough deep conversations that are about to happen. But he says, just the fact that this happened at all made me understand that mystery of the faith a little bit more. He says, there we shall witness what we hold in faith, not told by reason, but self-evident, as men perceive an axiom here on earth. So in heaven, we will be able to fully understand just by sight and perception what we here on earth have to hold only in faith, because we don't see proof of it as we perceive axioms here on earth. So we perceive things that are obviously true to us here on earth. It would be the same for the great mysteries in heaven. My lady, I replied, in every way my being can, I offer up my thanks to him who raised me from the world of clay. So he's doing what she told him. He's being grateful to God. But tell me what dark traces in the grain of this bright body show themselves below and cause men to tell fables about Cain. So this is a direct reference to what we call the man in the moon, right? The kind of shadowed areas. Of course, now we've walked on the moon and we understand that there's, craters and mountains and stuff like that that's what causes that. Well, this is way before that. So he's talking about this fable that people referred to. It was the shadow of Cain on the moon, or his bush of thorns, Cain's bush of thorns on the moon. It was all kind of old wives' tales, fable, whatever. And so he's saying, well, what is this? What is it that makes this? And so she smiled a moment and then answered me. If the reckoning of mortals fails to turn the lock to which your senses hold no key, the arrows of wonder should not run you through. Even when led by the evidence of the senses, the wings of reason often do not fly true. But what do you believe the cause to be? So she says, if you can't figure it out, if the reckoning of mortals can't prove something on earth, then you shouldn't be bothered to wonder about it at this point, because the answer is here. Now, and then she turns around and she says, but what do you think it is? So then he presents his answer, to which she immediately says, nope, that's wrong. But she disproves it, in a couple of different ways. She states what he says, and then disproves it immediately. And I will read through it, but we'll get straight to the point here in a second. So she says, what do you believe the cause to be? And he says that these variations we observe are caused by bodies of varying density. So he says, so I believe that the moon, it has these various levels of density through which the sun's light shines essentially. So the moon is thinner in some places, right? And she says, you will certainly come to know your view is steeped in falsehood. So wrong, fail, not right. If you listen well to the counter arguments I shall offer you, the eighth sphere shines with many lamps, and these may observe to shine with various aspects, both in their qualities and quantities. So this begins going back to that very first tercet of the whole canto, when we talk about the glory of God raying forth through the universe and reflected from each thing in proportion to its worth. This is referring directly, this carrying that theme on. She says, so there are, God's light is shining through, and it's being reflected back in various ways, right? Okay, so then she's going to talk about this. If rare or dense alone could have produced all this, one power would have to be in all, whether equally or variously diffused. Diversity of powers can only spring from formal principles, and all but one would be excluded by your reasoning. Now, if rarity produced the marks you mention, then the matter of this planet must be transparent at certain points due to its rarefaction. Or it must be arranged like fat and lean within a body, as, so to speak, a book alternates pages. So what she's referring to here is basically like a steak, like fat and lean within a body. So she says, like a piece of steak that you get that has, nice red meat, and then it's got these like marbles of fat. So maybe the moon is like that. She said she's stating his point. Or like a book alternates pages. So books used to be the pages were made of vellum, skin. It was very thin, but on one side was smooth, the flesh part, and the other side was obviously like the hair part, like you could see the follicles. And so she's just saying it's either one of those. Like, is that what you're saying that the moon would have to be like if it changed density for light to shine through? But it may be seen in eclipse that the first cannot be true, for then the sun's light, as it does in striking rare matter of any sort, would pass it right through. Since it does not, we may then pass along to the second case, and if I prove it false, I shall have shown that your whole thought is wrong. If this rare matter is not spread throughout the planet's mass, then there must be a limit at which the denser matter will turn about the sun's rays, which, not being allowed to pass, will be reflected as light and color are from the leaded back of a clear looking glass. And now she kind of sets forth this almost like science experiment to disprove the second part. She says, now you may argue in Avicenna's tract that the ray seems darker in one place than in others, since it is being reflected from further back. From such an instance, if you will do your part, you may escape by experiment, that being the spring that feeds the rivers of man's art. So she sets us up with a science experiment. Take 3 clear mirrors. Let 2 be set out at equal distance from you. Now a third between them further back. Okay, so over there, all kind of facing you. Now turn about to face them. Okay, so we're going to turn around and face them. And let someone light behind your back a candle or something, and so that it strikes all 3 and is reflected from them to your sight. Although the image from the greater distance is smaller than the others, you must note that all 3 shine back with an equal brilliance. Now, as the power of the sun's rays will strip the wintry ground on which the snow has lain of the cold and color that held it in their grip, so you, with mind stripped clean, shall I delight with such a radiance of the living truth that it will leap and tremble in your sight. So she says she's thoroughly disproved what he said in a couple of different ways. And now she's going to try to explain why it is that we see this variation or this inconstancy in the moon and the dark spots on the moon. Within the heaven of peace, beyond the sky, there rolls a body from whose power arises the being of all things that within it lie. We already know this, right? This is God. This is within the heaven of peace beyond the sky, the Empyrean. The other spheres, in various degrees, dispose the special powers they have within to their own causes and effects. All these great universal organs, as you know now, now know, proceed from grade to grade. So she's describing the progression of, starting, I guess, even starting from out going in. So God's on the outside, okay, in the fastest sphere, in the perfect sphere, and each then coming inward in the concentric circles, they're concentric spheres. There are various degrees of something. So we're getting to that point. But they all have special powers with their own causes and effects. Okay, so grade to grade, each in its order takes power from above and does its work below. Now then, note carefully how I move on through this path to the truth you seek, for thus you shall learn how to hold the fort alone. So she's like, pay attention, then hopefully you can draw your own correct conclusions. The motion and the power of the sacred gyres, as the hammer's art is from the smith, must flow from the blessed movers. It is their power inspires. And thus that heaven, made loveliest in its wheel by many lamps, from the deep mine that turns it, takes the image and makes itself the seal. And as the soul within your mortal clay is spread through different organs, each of which is shaped to its own end, in the same way the high angelic intelligence spreads its goodness diversified through all the many stars, while yet revolving ever in its oneness. So she's trying to describe, she's drawing a couple of kind of comparisons here. She says, so even in your body, your body has one purpose, and that's to make you live, right? Your physical body. It's supposed to function together. All of your organs have their own purpose, and they all do their job to keep you living. So she says it's the same thing with these spheres, right? God's light shines through, but even though his light and his glory is kind of coming through, each of the spheres is going to elucidate on a certain specific kind of talent or sanctity or blessedness. And so that's how we're going to kind of go through. And we've already talked about which blessed spirits are in each sphere. This is what she's saying. So even though this is just such a long, complicated conversation about this, but the point of it is that when we meet souls, they will, though they're all perfect, right? They're all in heaven and in unity with God's will. They all have different, well, the first ones even have different weaknesses, but they have different strengths. Okay, so God's light shows through in different quality and quantity. So his glory is shining through in different quality and quantity. And that's really the substance of what we're trying to get to here. This varying power is variously infused throughout the precious body that it quickens, in which, like life in you, it is diffused. Because of the glad nature from which it flows, this many-faceted power shines through that body as through the living eye, the glad soul glows. From this source only, not from rare and dense, comes that by one light and another differs, the formal principle, whose excellence, conforming to its own purposes, makes appear those markings you observe as dark and clear. So again, all of that, I'm out of breath now, is to say that the souls are all perfect. They all shine with God's perfection and unity with his will, but they reflect different qualities. Okay, so that's just the only thing that we need to keep in mind. She's explaining this to him so that as we move on and we begin to meet now, even just in this sphere of the moon, we're going to meet some people. And it's important for us to understand that they are going to be slightly different than the people that we then continue on to meet. So let's move on with that to Canto 3. I know that's really thick to get through, but we have a couple more conversations like that to have in Paradiso. Everything else I'll try to make a lot more straightforward, but that's one of those things we just kind of have to bear down and talk about for a second. So this one is page 16, I'm sorry, 615. And this is Canto 3. That sun that breathed love's fire into my youth had thus resolved for me, feature by feature, proving, disproving the sweet face of truth. I'm glad it was that easy for Dante. It wasn't that easy for me, and that's for sure. I, raising my eyes to her eyes, to announce myself resolved of error, and well assured, was about to speak. But before I could pronounce my first word, there appeared to me a vision. It seized and held me so that I forgot to offer her my thanks and my confession. So he begins to apologize for his error and thank her for her explanation. But before he can, he sees something. As in clear glass, when it is polished bright, or in a still and limpid pool whose waters are not so deep that the bottom is lost from sight, a footnote of our lineaments will show, so pallid that our pupils could as soon make out a pearl upon a milk-white brow. So I saw many faces eager to speak, and fell to the error opposite the one that kindled love for a pool in the smitten Greek. So the smitten Greek would be Narcissus, as a reference to Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection. So this one's opposite. So Dante is he's seeing other people's, what he comprehends as other people's reflections, and he's kind of not falling in love, but he's fascinated by them. And thinking the pale traces I saw there were reflected images, I turned around to face the source, but my eyes met empty air. So he's seeing these, what seem like reflections to him. So he turned around thinking there's people behind him, but there's nobody there. I turned around again like one beguiled. He's a little bit confused, and took my line of sight from my sweet guide, whose sacred eyes grew radiant as she smiled. Are you surprised that I smile at this childish act of reasoning, she said, since even now you dare not trust your sense of the true fact, but turn as usual back to vacancy? She's so mean to him. Just the stuff that she says to him, it's like, that hurt my feelings. These are true substances you see before you. They are signed here for inconstancy. So this is a really important thing, and this will kind of come up again, but all of these souls that we meet, so actually the first two spheres, the moon and Mercury, and this is the only place that we will see faces, okay? So anywhere beyond that, the souls appear as like balls of light, essentially, or points of light. But here they have little human characteristics, because these souls, they were a little bit off in their unity with God's will, just slightly off. I mean, it's still sacred, sanctified souls, but there's a caveat there somewhere, okay? Something that sticks, and we'll talk more about it. But here, they're assigned here for inconstancy. So remember, we talked about the moon, the sphere of inconstant souls. So these inconstant, so the moon, not only does it cycle in phase, but it has dark spots on it and brighter places and all this stuff. So it's a very, very good symbol of inconstancy. So they are assigned here for inconstancy to holy vows, any vow that's holy. So not just a vow to the holy life, like a religious vow, holy orders or whatever, but any vow that you make to God. So, and this theme kind of continues on, we'll keep talking about it, but any vow you make to God, even if you say, dear Lord, if you will, grant me this thing, then I will get up every day and do my morning devotional, or I will go to daily mass, or whatever it is. So these are vows that you are making to God. These are holy vows. Any vow made to God is holy. So this is any soul who has made a vow like that and broken it. Greet them, heed what they say, and so believe. For the true light that fills them permits no soul to wander from its rays. So she says, talk to them, learn from them. They can't lie to you. You did. That's cool. Don't go outside, okay? Stay in here. So she says, so talk to them and learn. So urged, I spoke to those pale spirits, turning to one who seemed most eager, and began like one whose mind goes almost blank with yearning. O well-created soul, who in the sun of the eternal life drinks in the sweetness which until tasted is beyond conception. Great would be my joy, would you confide to my eager mind your earthly name and fate. So he turns to the first soul who seems the most eager to talk to him and asks, hey, tell me who you are. That soul, with smiling eyes, at once replied, the love that fills us will no more permit hindrance to a just wish than does that love that wills all of its court to be like it. So there's going to be a lot of references to God's will. So she says, basically, if what you're asking of us is just, then because God in his justice and goodness wills justice, then we're going to have to answer you if you ask us something that's just. I was a virgin sister there below, and if you search your memory with care, despite my greater beauty, you will know I am Picarda, and I am placed here among these other souls of blessedness to find my blessedness in the slowest sphere. So Picarda is someone he should know. And she says, if you really look at me and recognize me, even though every soul is more beautiful in heaven, then you'll figure out I'm Picarda. And Picarda is Picarda Donati. We've already met Donatis before. And if you remember, Dante, the author, married Gemma Donati, okay? But we met Ferresi Donati, we've met Donatis before. Ferresi was in Purgatorio. So here's Picarda, and she is in paradise. But she says, I have found my blessedness in the slowest sphere. So in this first sphere. Our wishes, which can have no wish to be but in the pleasure of the Holy Ghost, rejoice in being formed to his decree. So they have no wish other to be outside of what is God's will. And this low-seeming post, which we are given, is ours because we broke, or in some part slighted, the vows we offered to heaven. And I then, something inexpressibly divine shines in your face, subliming you beyond your image in my memory. Therefore, I found you difficult to place, but now, with the assistance of your words, I find the memory easier to retrace. So he says, actually, I do recognize you, and I remember the story now. But tell me, please, do you who are happy here have any wish to rise to higher station, to see more, or to make yourselves more dear? So he says, so you're out here, you're in the lowest place possible in paradise. Are you happy here? Don't you want to be higher up in heaven? She smiled, as did the spirits at her side, and then turning to me with such joy, she seemed to burn with the first fire of love, replied, brother, the power of love, which is our bliss, calms all our will. What we desire, we have. There is in us no other thirst than this. Were we to wish for any higher sphere than our desires, would not be in accord with the high will of him who wills us here. She says, nope, happy just where we are. We don't wish to be anywhere else because this is where God wants us to be. And our will is in complete unity with God's will. And if love is our whole being, and if you weigh love's nature well, then you will see that discord can have no place among these circles. Nay, the essence of this blessed state of being is to hold all our will within his will, whereby our wills are one and all agreeing. And so the posts we stand from sill to sill throughout this realm please all the realm as much as they please him who wills us to his will. There's a lot of will in there. But the point is, all the will is going in one direction, right? We in heaven are all united with whatever God wants, and we're happy with that. There's nothing to be unhappy about in that, or dissatisfied, or there's no envy, there's no desire beyond what has been given us. We're completely satisfied, and not just satisfied, but like joyfully satisfied with where we are. It in his will is our peace. It is that sea to which all moves, all that itself creates and nature bears through all eternity. Then it was clear to me that everywhere in heaven is paradise, through the perfect grace, though the perfect grace does not rain down alike on all souls there. So he says, suddenly I realized everywhere in heaven is paradise. It doesn't matter if you're in the slowest sphere on all the way out to sitting right next to the Lord himself, right? We are all there. Though his perfect grace doesn't kind of rain down on us equally, we're all in paradise. So the amount of grace, the substance, its quality almost doesn't, it's almost irrelevant. We're still there. We're there. We're in heaven. So he says, but as at times we have had our fill of one food and still hunger for another, we put this by with gratitude while still asking for that. Just so I begged to know by word and sign, through what warp she had not entirely passed the shuttle of her vows. So he says, I was really curious. Now that I had this one thing satisfied, I was still hungry for the knowledge of this other part of it. So how exactly was it that you were not true to your vow? And so she explains, the perfection of her life and her great worth enshrine a lady here above, she said, in whose rule some go cloaked and veiled on earth. And she's referring here to Saint Clare of Assisi. That till their death they may live day and night with that sweet bridegroom who accepts of love all vows it makes that add to his delight. So she was of the order of Saint Clare in a monastery. As a girl, I fled the world to walk the way she walked and closed myself into her habit, pledged to her sisterhood to my last day. Then men came, men more used to hate than love. They tore me away by force from the sweet cloister. What my life then became is known above. So she, and we kind of know this story, or we now know this story. She's basically says, and this happened quite frequently, where these women would go and cloister into the convent, and then something would happen, and their brothers or their fathers or their uncles or their cousins would take them out of the convent and either marry them. You had uncles marrying nieces and stuff like that, or marry them off for political reasons, or these things, family alliances and things like this. So they forced them to break the vow of taking the habit, and of course then celibacy and all this stuff, chastity, and made them enter a different charism of life. And so against their will, but they didn't have any choice in it. Okay, so they broke their vow, but they didn't have full it wasn't in their own consent. So and we'll talk here in a second about a couple one very interesting distinction we need to make. So and the words here, the verbiage is extremely strong. She says, they tore me away by force from the sweet cloister. So they didn't just come and knock on the door and say, hey, would you mind marrying this guy? And she was like, yeah, sure, I'll go ahead and do that for you. No, it wasn't like that. They tore her from the cloister and made her marry this guy, which in all actuality and truth, she hated this guy. He was awful. So anyway, but she had to marry him. So she did. This other splendor, who lets herself appear here to my right to please you, shining full of every blessedness that lights this sphere, and understands in herself all that I say. She too was a nun. From her head, as from mine, the shadow of the veil was ripped away. Against her will and all propriety, she was forced back to the world. Yet even there, her heart was ever veiled in sanctity. She is the radiance of the Empress Constance, who by the second blast of Swabia conceived, and bore its third and final puissance. So this is the Empress Constance, who was in a convent, was taken out, ripped from the convent, and actually became the mother of Frederick II, who we've also talked about. She finished and at once began to sing Ave Maria, and singing sank from view like a weight into deep water, plummeting out of my sight, which followed while it could, and then, having lost her, turned about once more to the target of its greater wish and good, and wholly gave itself to the delight of the sweet vision of Beatrice. But she flashed so radiantly upon my sight that I, at first, was blinded, and thus was slow to ask of her what I most wished to know. So he meets these two ladies, or talks to the one, and then she says, and by the way, this lady next to me went through the same experience. So then he has this question, turns to Beatrice and loses himself in her beauty. Okay, so that's fine. So this question that he has, we now it's like a cliffhanger. We have to answer in the next canto. So, or we have to even figure out what it is, right? And this will bring us into the discussion I was talking about with the two kinds of will, I should say. So let's just move on. And this is page 622, Canto 4. A man given free choice would starve to death between two equidistant foods, unable to get either to his teeth. So would a lamb in counterbalanced fear tremble between two she-wolves and stand frozen. So would a hound stand still between two deer. So given these two options, if equal threats or equal temptation, you're torn, you're still stuck in the middle. If I stood mute then, tugged to either side, I neither blame myself nor take my doubt, it being necessary as cause for pride. I did not speak, but on my face at once were written all my questions and my yearnings, far more distinctly than I could pronounce. And Beatrice did as Daniel once had done when he raised Nebuchadnezzar from the wrath that made him act unjustly in Babylon. Daniel read the writing on the wall, so Beatrice is reading the writing in Dante's brain. I see full well how equal wish and doubt tear you two ways, she said, so that your zeal tangles upon itself and cannot breathe out. You reason, if the will that vowed stays true, how can another's violence take away from the full measure of bliss that is my due? So the question that she has read in his heart or brain intellect is, if my heart made this vow and I wanted to keep this vow, but some external force that I had no control over forced me out of it, how can I still be held accountable for breaking the vow? That's the question. And I see a second doubt perplex that thought, because the souls you seem to return to the stars from which they came, as Plato taught. So this is actually a second question that he had that's sort of actually, it's related, but only just talking about Plato's work Timaeus, talking and the idea put forth in Timaeus was that basically souls descended from stars, and then when they died, they returned right back to their stars. These are the questions that bear down your will with equal force. Therefore, I shall treat first the one whose venom has more power to kill. So she says, the first one I'm going to answer is the one that is more dangerous. Okay, so heresy, specifically, in terms of this question about Plato's work. Choose the most godlike of the seraphim. Take Moses or Samuel, or take either John or even Mary. Not one is nearer him, nor holds his seat atop the blessed spheres in any heaven apart from those you saw, nor has his being more or fewer years. All add their beauty to the highest wheel, share the sweet life, and vary in it only by how much of the eternal breath they feel, the quality of the virtue that they exhibited. What are you doing? So what she's saying here, okay, we'll keep on going, and then we'll talk about it. It says, they showed themselves here, not because this post has been assigned to them, but to symbolize that they stand lowest in the heavenly host. So must one speak to mortal imperfection, which only from the sensible apprehends whatever it then makes fit for intellection. So the point here that she's making, and it's important for us to understand this as well, is that all of heaven is paradise. All of the souls actually exist in the Empyrean with God. They're all there. They are presenting themselves within these spheres because that is where the quality of their virtue is limited to. Okay, so because mortals are limited in understanding, this is the way that they are being presented to a mortal, to Dante. Okay, and then thus to us. So their substance is showing through in these different spheres, but she's saying everybody is in heaven with God. So physically, or if a soul has any kind of physical body, they're with God, but their substance only shows through in these spheres so that we are able to comprehend justice, true justice, in the way that God is truly righteous and just. So, and that's really important to understand. Nobody's being denied the heavenly presence, I guess, is the whole point, right? They're all in the presence of God. So, okay, so next page, 624. Scripture in like manner condescends, describing God as having hands and feet, as signs to men of what more it portends. So So she says, just like scripture says, God, God has, be the hands and feet of God, or God has hands and feet. He doesn't really, right? That's just the way that we can, as humans, comprehend and apprehend the powers of God, or the things of God. So Holy Church shows you in mortal guise the images of Gabriel and of Michael and of the other who gave back Tobit's eyes, Raphael. So she says, just like the church presents these images of angels, we know angels they're not as they are presented, right? So again, we just, for humanity's understanding's sake, the information is presented in a certain way so that we can comprehend the point. For if Timaeus, this is that work I was talking about, Plato's work, as seems rather clear, spoke literally, what he says about souls is nothing like the truth shown to us here. He says the soul finds its own star again, from which, as he imagined, nature chose it to give form to the flesh and live within men. But it may be the words he uses hide a second meaning, which, if understood, reveals a principle no man may deride. So Plato, she says, was always taken literally, but maybe he meant something more, right? And so she's trying to give the benefit of the doubt, but really what she's trying to do is squash the heresy of the thought that, because remember, Dante was classically educated. He was a big reader of Plato and Aristotle. So for her to, this heresy that he might hold as truth in his brain needs to be squashed in, so that the truth can be more evident to him. If he means that the blame or honor due the influence of each sphere returns to it, his arrow does hit something partly true. This principle, misunderstood, once drove almost the whole world to attach to planets such names as Mars and Mercury and Jove. Okay, so that's the one question, right? The question that he asked second, but she saw as a higher priority. So she answered that one first. So we're going back now to the original question that he had, the one about being held accountable for something you actually didn't choose. So here we go. And this is where our discussion about will is going to take an interesting turn. The other doubt that agitates your mind is not as venomous, for not all its malice could drive you from my side to wander blind. For mortal men to argue that they see injustice in our justice is in itself a proof of faith, not poisonous heresy. But since the truth of this lies well within the reach of your own powers, I shall explain it just as you wish. If violence, to begin, occurs when those who suffer its abuse contribute nothing to what forces them, then these souls have no claim to that excuse. For the will, if it will not, cannot be spent, but does as nature does within a flame, 1,000 or 10,000 winds have bent. So she says, if it's only the fact that, for instance, Piccarda Donati had been forced out of the convent by her brother in a way, to break her vow by her brother. If that was only it, she wouldn't be considered inconstant. There's more to it, okay? Her absolute, this is the discussion, absolute will versus conditioned will or conditional will. So absolute will, that's the will that we have that's true and right, that's in accordance with what God wills for us. This is what drove these people to make this this vow, and something came externally and pushed them away from that. If we're imagining it like kind of on a straight and narrow road, there was some kind of physical part that they didn't have control over, that some physical influence that pushed them off of that road. Okay, it doesn't affect their absolute will. Their absolute will was that they stay in the convent. That's what they truly wanted. If it yields of itself, even in the least, then it assists the violence, as did these who could have gone back to the holy feast. So in both of the cases, in the case of Piccarda Donati and the case of the Empress, okay, we had these women who we know historically they took this vow, that's fine, they're fine. Then they were forced out of it to marry and then to have kids. But then what happens later? What happens when their husbands die, as we know happened with these two particular ladies? Their husbands die, their children are grown, they don't need them anymore. What is keeping them out of the convent at that point, right? So the point is that they didn't keep to the absolute will. They then allowed their will to be conditioned by these external influences, okay? So one of my favorite analogies to this is something like, for instance, like when we went into quarantine at the beginning of this whole COVID thing. So say your mom and dad had an ongoing agreement, that your dad vowed to your mom, I'm gonna take you out to dinner every Friday night and just spend time with you every Friday night as holy sacramentally married couple. And that's my vow to you that we're gonna do that. Well, when COVID hit and the quarantine, we were all locked in our houses essentially. There were no restaurants, right? There was no way for your mom and dad to keep that vow and keep going out to eat every Friday night. So that is the external, force that kept them from doing that. But their absolute will was to keep doing that. Their intention, they wanted to keep going out every Friday night. Well, then when quarantine was lifted and people could start, restaurants were opening again and they could go back to it and they didn't, then, for instance, like if that was a vow made by your dad to your mom would probably be like, don't you think we should start going out to eat again and spending time together on Friday nights? And, if your dad said something like, oh, well, we got out of the habit, so, it doesn't really matter. Quarantine kind of, killed that vow or whatever. No, that's what we're talking about here. We, once we have the opportunity to return to that will, to that absolute will, the one that's in line with what God wants for us, then we absolutely should. Otherwise, we're agreeing to the breakage, and we are now guilty of that. We are the inconstant ones. Same thing with, the church. A lot of people didn't go to church during a lot of that quarantine time. We couldn't, right? But then once we could go back and it was fine to go back, a lot of people never went back. So, and this is a huge, huge problem now. So again, this is the difference between absolute will and conditioned will. So this is what Beatrice is trying to say. It wasn't the original intent for these women to break their vow, but it absolutely was. They're definitely guilty of not returning to that life once they had the opportunity. So that's the difference, okay? And I think this is a really important difference to understand, because life happens all the time. We've had more life happening in the past couple of years than, it's been crazy, right? But so we have all these best intentions, say even simple stuff. I'm going to exercise. I'm going to, do whatever. I'm going to eat right. And then you get sick and you can't eat right or whatever. And then you get out of the habit, and then and we all know we should eat right, but it's hard to get back to it, right? So again, these kinds of things where we make these promises to ourselves or to other people, our will is absolute. We need to make sure that we don't have negatively conditioned will that then, pushes us outside of what we should be doing. So all of that is to describe the absolute versus conditioned will. But that's why these people are here, and they're still in heaven, right? Their hearts truly desired and made that initial vow to God, but though it wasn't their fault they got pushed away from it, it was their fault that they didn't return to it. So then we have this continued kind of discussion. If their whole will had joined in their desire, as whole will upheld Lawrence on the grill and Mutius with his hand thrust in the fire. Y'all remember the story of St. Lawrence, right? He was captured and tried to force into apostasy, and they had him grilling. And instead of screaming out for mercy, get me off the grill, he actually said, okay, well, turn me over. I'm done on this side, right? His was a gleeful acceptance of God's will, joyful acceptance of God's will, of his own martyrdom. And Mutius, of course, Mutius in Porsenna, Mutius said, I am a citizen of Rome, and thrust his right hand into the fire and showed no indication that it hurt at all. And this was given the moniker the left-handed, Mutius the left-handed. So I mean, this is what she's saying. If these women had will like Mutius and St. Lawrence, then they would have absolutely died before they were even taken from the convent, but especially before they were kept from it. Okay, so that's the difference. Just so it would have forced them to return to their true way the instant they were free. But such pure will is too rare, we must learn. If you have gleaned them diligently, then these words forever destroy the argument that would have plagued your mind time and time again. But now another pass opens before you, so straight and tortuous that without my help, you would tire along the way and not win through. I made you understand beyond all doubt that these souls cannot lie, for they exist in the first truth and cannot wander out. Later, you heard Picarda say that she who stood beside her kept her love of the veil, and it seems that what she said contradicts me. Time and again, my brother, men have run from danger by a path they would not choose, and on it done what ought not to be done. So bending to his father's prayer, did he who took his mother's life, Alcmaeon, I mean, who sought his piety in impiety. So this is in purgatory. We met this guy. So Alcmaeon was told by his father to kill his mother, to avenge the fact that she had accepted a bribe to reveal some plans of his. And yeah, so that's kind of the reference there. So now weigh within your own intelligence how will and violence interact. So joining that, no excuse can wipe out the offense. There's no excuse for some sins. Okay. Absolute will does not will its own harm, but fearing worse may come if it resists, consents the more, the greater its alarm. Thus, when Picarda spoke as she did to you, she meant the absolute will, and I the other. So both of us spoke only what was true. Such was the flowing of that stream so blessed, it flows down from the fountain of all truth. Such was the power that laid my doubts to rest. Beloved of the first love, O holy soul, I said then, you whose words flow over me and with their warmth quicken and make me whole. There is not depth enough within my love to offer you due thanks, but may the one who sees and can answer for me above. Man's mind, I know, cannot win through the mist unless it is illuminated by the truth, by that truth beyond which truth has nowhere to exist. In that, once it has reached it, it can rest like a beast within its den, and reach it can, else we're all longing vain, and vain the test. Like a new tendril yearning for man's will, doubt sprouts to the foot of truth. It is that in us that drives us to the summit from hill to hill. By this I am encouraged, by this bidden, my lady, in all reverence, to ask your guidance to a truth that still lies hidden. So here comes another question he's got. Can such as these, who put away their veils, so compensate by other good works done, that they be not found wanting on your scales? So this question, again, very relevant, especially to those of us who may have made some of those silly vows to God, silly vows. Those to the convent, of course, are not holy order. That's not silly. But sometimes we promise things to God that may seem a little bit frivolous in the end. So he says, can we make up for these things that, these vows that we break? Beatrice looked at me, and her glad eyes, afire with their divinity, shot forth such sparks of love that my poor faculties gave up the reins, and with my eyes cast down, I stood entranced, my senses all but flown. Don't think she's going to get out of answering this question. She does answer this question in the next canto. But again, we have this very interesting transition where, he looks at her and he's just like, oh, and just kind of loses. We know he's sort of sensitive. He swoons pretty often, but he swoons consistently in these transitional periods and in Paradiso. It's okay. He does get stronger, I promise. But here in the beginning, it's a little bit difficult for him. So next week, we will talk about cantos 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then we will have spring break the following week after that. So do you guys have any questions about cantos 1 through 4 this week? I know that was a lot of kind of heavy conversation, but any questions?
So
No?
it says, how it says that they're both like with God, and at the same time they're in the sphere of the moon.
Mhm.
So is the sphere of the moon part of heaven, or is
Yeah.
it like a separate place?
So it is if we think about it as even like a high-rise building, right? So think of heaven as a high-rise building, and God's on the top floor having a party on the rooftop deck. Okay, that all of these spheres are sort of levels to heaven, but everybody is on the rooftop. It's almost like they're having these little Zoom presentations on each floor to present the souls who exemplify those virtues that are represented in that sphere. So everybody's
Okay.
actually on the rooftop, but Dante, so that her frail little human minds can apprehend and comprehend what is trying to be the truths that are trying to be shown to us, we can only see their substances and on the level where their qualities exist. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So like the true heaven is just where God is. So like these are kind of just like stepping stones almost to
Yes.
true heaven. Okay.
Yes. It's all part of paradise. Like he said, he suddenly realizes that this is all heaven. This is all paradise. But God's grace is falling like raindrops, and it's falling, more heavily on some people and less heavily on some other people. But everybody's fine with it. Everybody's totally fine with the rain that they're getting. Okay, like that sports analogy. Everybody's in the baseball stadium and everybody's in their favorite seat, and nobody's complaining about anything, right? Because we're all there in the presence of God. So,
Yeah.
all right. Any other
Okay.
questions?
Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
I think we're good. Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, I will.
So much.
What's that?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'll get this video uploaded. I think I still need to get last week's uploaded to the classroom, but then I will see you guys next Wednesday, Cantos 5, 6, 7, and 8.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye, guys.